Hi, and welcome back. I won't pretend I didn't know this was coming. The feature has been available in pre-release versions for a while. Nevertheless, it was exciting to see oversampling features finally make it into the release version of Reaper. To be specific, you can now right-click a plugin and set it to run at a higher multiple of the project's sample rate. 2, 4, 8, or 16 times higher, which should in theory reduce aliasing from nonlinear processes such as saturation, distortion, and compression. You can also set oversampling for an entire effects chain, which will reduce the number of up and down sampling filters required, just one at the start and end of the chain instead of every individual plugin in that chain. But this isn't necessarily better, as we shall see. Up till now, the only way to do this kind of thing was to wrap your plugin or plugin chain inside something like Meta Plugin from DDMF, which provides its own oversampling options. Having this feature built into the DAW is obviously much more convenient. Note that I'm going to assume a basic understanding of what aliasing is and how oversampling helps. If you're not clear on that, I suggest watching this Samplerates video I made for the FabFilter channel first. Link in the description in case the card doesn't work. So perhaps the first thing I should do is check that it actually works. If you've been watching my channel for long enough, you might remember me testing the oversampling options in ReaComp and discovering that they simply didn't work properly and did nothing whatsoever to reduce aliasing. And ever since my video dropped, that ReaComp feature has been hidden from the main panel. Now, I didn't really think they'd make that mistake again, but I confess I was slightly nervous before testing it the first time. I'm starting with a sine wave sweep, which we're viewing as a spectral image, hence this diagonal line. Note that it's a linear sweep, not logarithmic, meaning that to human ears it seems to rush through the lower pitches and linger in the highs. And note that I've also set a linear vertical scale for the spectral display. This won't always be optimal for spectral editing, but using a linear sweep and a linear scale makes the aliasing easier to see and understand. I'm going to test a plugin that includes switchable oversampling that I already know works properly, so we can compare it to Reaper's implementation. Here's FabFilter Saturn 2 running the heavy saturation style, which is quite a hard distortion that generates lots of higher harmonics. Here's what we get with no oversampling. That's a mess, right? And if I play the sweep, the aliasing is clearly audible with weird chirpy sounds and harmonics clearly sweeping in the wrong direction. Okay, now here's the same thing with FabFilter's good oversampling. With such an extreme example, this is nowhere near enough to completely remove aliasing, but still it's much less of a mess than with no oversampling. And if we listen to it, in fact, the improvement is dramatic. Okay, and again, using the superb FabFilter oversampling, it's looking pretty good now, and sounds pretty clean as well. In case you're wondering, if I switch to linear phase oversampling, the results look exactly the same. This test doesn't show phase differences. We'll come to that shortly. Alrighty, let's turn off the FabFilter oversampling and try Reaper's instead. Here's 4 times oversampled, and 8 times, and 16 times. And I can breathe a sigh of relief. No repeat of the ReaComp story. This oversampling actually works as advertised, and seems just as effective at reducing aliasing as the FabFilter built-in oversampling. This is a very promising start. Now I'm curious to know if the up and down sampling filters are minimum phase or linear phase. So here's a Dirac spike, simply one single full-scale sample in a river of zeros. I'm going to run that through an instance of ReaComp with 16 times oversampling, but no actual processing at all, so we can see exactly what happens to our impulse. And that's quite exciting. At least, to someone like me, it is. Notice the ringing from the oversampling filters starts before the impulse and is symmetrical around it. That means it's linear phase. That has a couple of implications. It's going to inevitably add latency. And yes, indeed, it's quite noticeable when playing a synth in real time, or when playing a guitar through an amp simulator. This type of oversampling is to be avoided when tracking and monitoring through the plugin chain. But I consider it superior for mixing, for reasons I've examined in a previous video, so I won't repeat myself. Okay, next, a null test. I've started with white noise. I'm running that through an instance of Pro-C2 with 4 times oversampling enabled, then subtracting the result from the original noise, and this is what's left over. Note that the analyzer is zoomed right into the high frequencies, and all these differences we see are comfortably above 20 kHz. This is normal and expected. It's the anti-aliasing filter starting to kick in and remove content above Nyquist. These filters are steep, but not infinitely so, and in order to remove more or less everything above half the sample rate, they need to start rolling off a bit lower than that. Just to demonstrate that this is indeed normal for a high-quality oversampling plugin, let's swap C2 for the glue from Cytomic, also running 4 times oversampling, and the results look very much the same. Okay, now let's try an instance of ReaComp, upsampled 4 times using the Reaper algorithm, and we seem to have a much steeper filter. If I was ever capable of hearing content above 20k, that ability is long gone now. It's ironic that when my ears were at their peak in terms of frequency response, they were totally untrained, and I couldn't make use of that capability. If you have young ears, perhaps you'll be able to hear the difference, and perhaps you'll perceive the steeper filter as better. It would appear to be so, based on this test. On the other hand, if you can hear the difference in frequency response, maybe you'll also be able to hear the filters ringing. If we compare the impulse responses, the Reaper filters do indeed ring for longer either side of the impulse. So I'm going to conclude that they've each settled on a different compromise between filter steepness and ringing, but are nevertheless broadly equivalent in terms of quality and effectiveness. But this is a great result. ReaComp now has more powerful oversampling options than Pro-C2, being capable of 16 times oversampling rather than just 4 times. And arguably this is necessary, given that ReaComp's parameter ranges allow for brutal wave shaping style distortion. Let's try it on a drum loop. Here with no oversampling. And here with 16 times oversampling. Was that difference smaller than you expected? Oversampling won't stop nasty intermodulation between different elements, of course, but it will remove some extra grungy fuzz around the edges. The oversampled version sounds slightly better defined and more focused. While the non-oversampled version has a veil of extra crustiness on top. As I'm writing this script, I can almost hear the voices of future viewers shouting, "Decapitator!" Okay then, let's take a look. This is perhaps the most famous distortion plugin of all time, excepting maybe Vintage Warmer. But the lack of oversampling is a glaring omission that many have commented on, and that we can finally do something about. Or can we? Let's test it quickly first. Here's our sweep, running through default settings apart from the drive and gain. 4 times oversampled version on the bottom. And yes, indeed, there's much less aliasing with 4 times oversampling. What does that sound like, though? Here's that drum loop again, with some Decapitator special spicy sauce. And now with 4 times oversampled special spicy sauce. Again, the difference is kind of subtle, but there's an extra layer of digital grunge without the oversampling, which goes away with it. I would say that the oversampled version sounds more analog. If that phrase ever means anything, this is surely one of those times. But better is more subjective. While I lean towards the oversampled version in this case, it's quite possible that in a different context I would actually like the aliasing and prefer to keep it. So I'm going to suggest that you always listen carefully to the difference when you oversample a plugin, and don't assume that less aliasing will always be preferable. So what if I go higher, like 8 times or 16 times? Well, I would love to tell you, but if I try anything higher than 4 times, it crashes and takes Reaper down with it, so I won't do that now. And this illustrates the first little caveat with this feature. The plugin you're using has to be capable of running at really high sample rates. From the plugin's perspective, 16 times oversampling means it thinks you're running your project sample rate 16 times higher than you actually are, 768 kilohertz instead of 48 kilohertz. How many of your plugins are capable of running in a 768 kilohertz project? Perhaps you're about to find out. Decapitator's apparent assumption that 192 kHz is the highest sample rate it needs to support is disappointing in this context, but not unreasonable, really. However, crashing is not the only issue you need to watch out for. For example, here's a cool amp sim that I found on the Computer Music cover disc. Tube Amp Ultra 530 from Mercurial, Computer Music Edition. Not the type of guitar sound I reach for often, but satisfying nonetheless. Hard, heavy distortion is the worst culprit when it comes to aliasing, so perhaps this model will benefit from oversampling. Let's try 4 times to start with. Oh, that's kind of hilarious. Honey, I shrunk the guitars. If the plugin isn't written to accommodate the sample rate it's running at, you might end up with filters running at the wrong frequencies. 2 whole octaves higher than intended in this case. And the resulting issues will probably be a lot bigger than a bit of aliasing. I should point out that this is not a bug in the plugin. A bit of poking around the interface reveals that this plugin is intentionally limited to run at 44.1 kHz only, and you need to buy the full version to run other sample rates or use oversampling. Fair enough, I guess. But beware that filters at the wrong frequency is a more profound problem than you might realise. If you're thinking that a compressor won't be affected, consider that the envelope followers and gain reduction smoothing are all essentially just filters. So if your compressor isn't properly accounting for the sample rate, it will have all the wrong timings, and the sound will change almost as dramatically as this guitar amp. So let's find a plugin that might benefit from oversampling, that doesn't already include its own, and that doesn't mind running a sample rate 16 times higher than is sensible. Here's FabFilter Twin 2. I use this synth a lot, actually, despite the fact that it's getting very old and is well overdue an update. It's really light on CPU and quick and fast to program, so it's what I tend to load when I need to get a melody or chord structure down quickly, and I'm not sure what's going to play those notes yet. While my Twin 2s often get swapped out for other synths as the production progresses, quite often they don't, as I'm perfectly happy with what Twin 2 is doing. In this case, it's just producing pure sine waves, driven from an arpeggiator. I'm not even using the filters. There are no harmonics being generated, and no aliasing. So oversampling this would just be a complete waste of resources. Just to make it even more pointless, I'm processing the output with a FabFilter Saturn II running the Destroy style, which is mostly sample rate reduction. In other words, I'm intentionally adding aliasing at this stage. Notice how boring it sounds without it. Again, don't assume that aliasing will always sound bad. So I'm going to have to build a Twin 2 patch specifically to create audible and undesirable aliasing. And with a synth this old, that's frankly not too difficult. Here's a sound that pushes on all the weak pressure points. I'm using oscillator sync, which is notoriously difficult to anti-alias. I've got vibrato going, although not continuously because that sounds pants. I'm not sure if vibrato actually makes anti-aliasing more difficult, but it certainly makes the resulting aliasing more obvious, as aliased partials vibrate in the wrong direction and sound more out of place. And let's play this up high. No, higher than that. There we go. Isn't that horrible? Let's make this a tiny bit easier to listen to with some delay and reverb. There, that's a little better. It's not hard to discern the aliased artifacts on this sound, right? And perhaps, in the right context, those grungy, chirpy additions might be desirable. However, here's how it sounds with 16 times oversampling. And that's a really big difference. So that's a win, and possibly instances of Twin 2 are now a little more likely to survive till my final mix without getting swapped out for something else first. So there are definitely scenarios in which these new oversampling features can be beneficial. There is a but, though, because it's also possible for this feature to not help you at all and maybe mess you up badly. I've already seen a forum post requesting an action or script to switch on chain oversampling for all tracks simultaneously. And I didn't need to read down the thread to know why they wanted it. They planned to oversample their entire mix, probably putting it in a state where it can't play back in real time, so they could then render it offline. Presumably they expect to then get a mix 16 times better than the one they were listening to beforehand. I've touched on a couple of the reasons why this would be a bad idea already. Assuming your mix doesn't crash immediately anyway, I don't recommend rendering something you haven't just been listening to. Oversampling a plugin may have unexpected results, especially if you're pushing it beyond any limits the developer anticipated. And even if it works fine and correctly reduces aliasing, you shouldn't assume that the anti-aliased version will fit your mix better. It might, but it might not. You need to listen to the difference and check before you render. Also, indiscriminately oversampling everything means oversampling a lot of plugins that won't benefit at all. Examples: this mid-side matrix. There's nothing to go wrong at higher sample rates, granted, but absolutely no benefit either. This EQ won't benefit from higher sample rates in any way at all. A noise gate. If you're exploiting a very fast attack to deliberately add extra click to a kick drum, for example, then you might benefit from oversampling. But if your gate is set to open before the signal starts, using look ahead, and close after it stops, using hold, the gain modulation is never going to touch the wanted signal and won't alias, so oversampling would be pointless. What about a convolution reverb? This is 100% linear and fairly CPU heavy to start with. You want to multiply the CPU use by 8 or 16 times for no benefit whatsoever? Mining cryptocurrencies might be a better use of your processor cycles. Next point, if a plugin includes its own internal oversampling, and it's a well-written plugin from a developer who knows what they're doing, you're probably still better off using the plugin's own oversampling rather than brute forcing it from the outside. The developer of the plugin will have the option to only oversample the parts of the code that require it, like a modulated gain stage, for example, while not bothering with other parts that wouldn't benefit, such as a static input gain or mid-side matrixing. Or they could even use different oversampling factors for different parts of the plugin. The sidechain of a compressor might have 8 or 16 times oversampling, while the gain stage only requires 2 times or 4 times, for example. Final point. Most of the time, chain oversampling is not optimal. Oversampling each nonlinear plugin individually is more effective at reducing aliasing than oversampling the entire chain. Here's a sweep running through 5 instances of ReaComp, each set to add another layer of hard clipping. With no oversampling, the aliasing is predictably severe. Now, here it is, oversampled 16 times as a chain. And now, each instance oversampled 16 times individually. Obviously, these both beat the naive version hands down, but the individual oversampling is clearly better. I explain the reason for this in more detail in the FabFilter Samplerates video that I've already linked to. Short version, oversampling gives us extra upper bandwidth above the Nyquist limit. If you have multiple nonlinearities in series, the first will start to fill up that extra bandwidth with extra harmonics, making the next nonlinearity more likely to alias than before, and so on down the chain. But if each nonlinear stage is oversampled individually, they each have a band-limited input signal and can all benefit fully from the extra bandwidth the oversampling provides. This brings the added benefit that you can tailor the amount of oversampling to that specific stage. A gentle, subtle saturation effect is unlikely to need more than 2 or 4 times oversampling, while harder distortion effects might well benefit from the 8 or 16 times settings. But here's one scenario where chain oversampling makes sense and works nicely in conjunction with the individual oversampling options. I'm going to start with this JS Distortion plugin. Not, I confess, the kind of thing I would normally do on a full mix. If I leave the gain at Unity, I can then use the max volume parameter like a threshold control and reduce the headroom until the mix starts to distort. Which sounds just as gnarly and messy as you would expect. Okay, next I'm going to add 2 ReaComp plugins, one before the distortion with a bass cut and a big high frequency boost, and the other after the distortion with exactly the opposite settings, a bass boost and a big high frequency cut. These 2 EQs now cancel each other out perfectly, and the sound is exactly the same as before, until I start to wind down the max volume slider and remove the headroom again. Now the distortion only really affects those boosted high frequencies. Listen to how it softens and smooths out the treble in this mix. Now this setup is a perfect candidate for chain oversampling. ReaComp cramps near Nyquist, you see, so these 10K bands, boosting and cutting, are slightly asymmetric and warped out of shape. 2 times oversampling fixes this nicely. Yes, technically 4 times oversampling is even better, but not in any way that my ears care about. As far as I'm concerned, any more than 2 times oversampling is a waste of resources if all you're doing is fixing cramping. These ReaComp plugins are still totally linear, however. They benefit from oversampling to fix the cramping, but they don't generate any higher harmonics, so they won't start to fill up the extra bandwidth we've gained by oversampling, and there's no need to filter that stuff out again before the next plugin in the chain. So in this case, we're absolutely fine to set 2 times oversampling for the whole chain and fix the cramping for both EQs in one go. But that distortion, though, hard distortion for high frequencies is a recipe for severe aliasing, so we definitely want more than 2 times oversampling. Let's set this plugin to the maximum 16 times setting. And notice what's now happened in the plugin list. The ReaComp plugins both declare themselves to be 2 times oversampled, as expected, but the distortion plugin in between is only saying 8 times, despite my setting it to 16 times. That's because it's already been upsampled 2 times by the chain setting, and Reaper therefore only needs another 8 times oversampling to get it to the target rate. So far, this is the only optimal use of chain oversampling that I've thought of. And this one has the slight disadvantage that any further plugins added to the chain will get 2 times oversampling, whether they need it or not. But there are ways to work around that, of course. Probably I've missed other valid uses for chain oversampling, however. Feel free to enlighten me in the comments if you've thought of another application. So, in summary, it's an awesomely powerful feature, implemented very well, as far as I can tell, and the Reaper devs are to be congratulated. But with great power comes great responsibility. Be careful what you oversample, and always listen carefully to the difference when you do. Note that I've made quite a few videos that touch on some of these subjects in more detail, and I think there are too many to add cards for them all, so feel free to check the description for links. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.